In 1966, a reclusive billionaire named Howard Hughes checked into the Desert Inn on the Las Vegas Strip, rented out 2 entire floors, and within weeks began purchasing casinos at a pace that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand what he was really doing, buying the mob out of the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. For nearly 2 decades before Hughes arrived, the city of Las Vegas had been designed, financed, built, and operated by a network of organized crime figures stretching from New York to Chicago to Kansas City to Miami, men who turned a dusty railroad stop in the Mojave Desert into the gambling capital of the world. But how did a loose confederation of racketeers, bookmakers, and killers manage to build a multi-billion-dollar industry from nothing, right under the nose of the federal government, and get away with it for so long? To understand the answer, you have to go back to a time before the neon, before the showgirls, before the fountains and the mega resorts, back to the early 1940s, when Las Vegas was little more than a wide spot on Highway 91 between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. The population hovered around 8,000. There were a handful of small gambling halls downtown, on Fremont Street, legalized since 1931, when Nevada, desperate for revenue during the Great Depression, became the only state in the Union to permit wide-open casino gambling. But nobody with serious money was paying attention. The town was hot, remote, and insignificant. It had no glamour, no infrastructure, and no reason for anyone outside of Nevada to care about it. That would change because of one man's obsession, one war's aftermath, and one network's ambition. The man was Benjamin Siegel. You know him as Bugsy, though calling him that to his face was a reliable way to get hurt. Siegel was a founding member of what law enforcement would later call the National Crime Syndicate, the loose but effective coalition of Italian and Jewish organized crime figures who by the late 1930s controlled illegal gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, and loan sharking across most of the major American cities. He had grown up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan alongside Meyer Lansky, and the two of them had built a criminal partnership that would prove more durable than most Fortune 500 companies. By the early 1940s, Siegel had relocated to Los Angeles, where he ran gambling operations, extorted Hollywood studios through control of labor unions, and cultivated friendships with actors and producers who found his danger intoxicating. But Siegel was restless. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to build. What Siegel saw in Las Vegas was something most legitimate businessmen couldn't yet imagine, a legal front for an illegal empire. If you could build a luxury resort casino in the Nevada desert, you could skim cash off the top of every bet, launder money from operations across the country, and do it all under the protection of state law. The gaming license made everything look legitimate. The desert made everything hard to monitor. And the isolation meant you could control who came in and who didn't. Siegel didn't invent this idea entirely on his own. A small resort called the El Rancho Vegas had opened on Highway 91 in 1941. And the Hotel Last Frontier followed in 1942, but Siegel was the first to see the concept at scale. He envisioned something that didn't exist anywhere in America, a full-service luxury resort with a casino floor, a showroom, restaurants, a swimming pool, and enough glamour to lure wealthy tourists from Los Angeles, just a few hours' drive away. The result was the Flamingo. Construction began in late 1945 on a patch of empty desert along what would become the Las Vegas Strip. And almost immediately, everything went wrong. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that the gap between a criminal's ambition and his operational competence is where the most revealing stories live. If you're new here, and this kind of deep dive into how organized crime actually shaped the modern world is what keeps you watching, consider subscribing. This channel exists to uncover the real mechanics behind the myths, and there's a lot more coming. Now back to the Flamingo, because what happened next set the template for everything Las Vegas would become. Siegel's original budget was roughly $1 million. By the time the Flamingo partially opened on December 26, 1946, costs had ballooned to approximately $6 million. Some estimates run even higher. Building materials were scarce in the post-war economy. Siegel was being systematically cheated by contractors who recognized that a mobster building an illegal cash machine in the desert wasn't going to call the Better Business Bureau. Worse, Siegel's girlfriend, Virginia Hill, was reportedly skimming construction funds and depositing them in Swiss bank accounts. The grand opening was a disaster. Bad weather grounded flights from Los Angeles. The few celebrities who attended lost money at the tables and left early. The hotel rooms weren't finished. Within 2 weeks, the Flamingo closed for renovations, having hemorrhaged cash at a staggering rate. Back east, the men who had financed the Flamingo were not amused. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, these were investors in the truest and most dangerous sense of the word. They had put up enormous sums on Siegel's promise, and the returns were non-existent. There were meetings. There were conversations that no one recorded but everyone remembered. The Flamingo reopened in March 1947 and slowly began turning a profit, but by then, the damage to Siegel's credibility was irreparable. On the night of June 20, 1947, as Siegel sat reading the Los Angeles Times in the living room of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion at 810 Linden Drive, a gunman fired 9 rounds through the window with a .30 caliber military carbine. 2 rounds struck Siegel in the head. He was 41 years old. The murder has never been officially solved. But the consensus among historians and law enforcement is clear. The syndicate ordered the hit. Within 20 minutes of Siegel's death, and this detail is chilling in its precision, associates of Meyer Lansky and Gus Greenbaum walked into the Flamingo and took over operations. Here's the part most people miss. Siegel's murder wasn't the end of the mob's involvement in Las Vegas. It was the beginning. Everything that came before was prologue, because the Flamingo, despite its chaotic birth, proved the concept. It showed that a luxury casino resort in the desert could generate enormous cash flow, attract wealthy tourists, and operate in a regulatory environment so permissive that organized crime figures could hold gaming licenses under the thinnest of fronts. The question was no longer whether Las Vegas could work. The question was, who would control it? The answer for the next 2 decades was essentially everyone in the American Mafia who had the capital and the foresight to invest. And the man who orchestrated this more effectively than anyone else was not a traditional mob boss in the Hollywood sense. He never carried a gun. He never raised his voice. His name was Meyer Lansky, and he was arguably the most important financial mind in the history of American organized crime. Lansky understood something fundamental. Cash businesses are the perfect mechanism for both generating and hiding illegal wealth. A casino takes in millions of dollars in cash every week. The amount that actually gets reported depends entirely on who is counting. If you control the count room, the secured area where cash from the tables and slot machines is tallied before being deposited, you control reality. You can skim tens of thousands of dollars per week, send it to partners across the country, and the books will still balance because the reported number is whatever you say it is. This was the skim, and it became the financial engine that powered organized crime in America for a generation. Throughout the 1950s, mob-connected casinos proliferated along the Strip. The Thunderbird opened in 1948 with financing linked to Lansky. The Desert Inn opened in 1950, built by Wilbur Clark, but bankrolled by Mo Dalitz and the Cleveland Syndicate, a group of former bootleggers who had transitioned into legitimate-looking businessmen without ever abandoning their criminal networks. The Sands opened in 1952 with hidden interests held by Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Lansky. The Sahara, the Riviera, the Dunes, the Stardust, one after another, the great casinos of the Las Vegas Strip rose out of the sand, and behind almost every one of them, if you followed the money carefully enough, you would find organized crime. Consider a surprising statistic. By 1955, the Nevada Gaming Control Board estimated that at least 11 of the major casinos on the Strip had hidden ownership interests linked to organized crime. That number was almost certainly conservative. The regulatory structure in Nevada during this period was, to put it charitably, accommodating. The state needed the revenue. The casinos provided jobs, tax dollars, and a booming tourism economy. There was very little incentive to look too closely at where the money was coming from, and the men who ran the casinos understood exactly how to exploit that dynamic. They hired frontmen, individuals with clean records who would apply for gaming licenses and appear as the official owners, while the real decisions and the real profits flowed to figures who never appeared on any paperwork. The Stardust, which opened in 1958, deserves particular attention because it became the single most lucrative skim operation in Las Vegas history. The casino was enormous, the largest in the world at the time, with over 1,000 rooms. It was originally conceived by Tony Cornero, a former bootlegger, but after Cornero dropped dead at a craps table at the Desert Inn in 1955. Some suspected poison, though it was officially ruled a heart attack. The Stardust was completed and taken over by a consortium that included frontmen for the Chicago outfit. For years, the skim at the Stardust funneled cash to bosses in Chicago, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. We're not talking about small amounts. FBI estimates from later investigations suggested that the skim from the Stardust alone amounted to millions of dollars per year, carried out of the casino in suitcases and delivered by couriers to mob bosses across the Midwest. The mechanics were remarkably simple. Casino employees loyal to the outfit would manipulate the count. Cash would be removed before it was officially recorded. Fill slips, the forms used to track how much money was added to gaming tables, would be altered or destroyed. Slot machine revenue would be underreported. And because the casinos were cash businesses operating in a state with minimal federal oversight, there was almost no way to detect the fraud from the outside. The IRS had neither the resources nor the legal tools to audit casino cash flows effectively. Nevada regulators were either complicit, underfunded, or both. Let's pause here for a pattern interrupt, because there's an ironic contrast worth noting. During this exact period, the mid-1950s through the early 1960s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was publicly denying the existence of organized crime in America. He insisted there was no such thing as the Mafia, no national syndicate, no coordinated network of criminal enterprises. While Hoover was making these pronouncements, mob money from Las Vegas casinos was flowing into the pockets of crime bosses in virtually every major American city. The reason for Hoover's denial has been debated for decades. Some historians believe he was being blackmailed. Others argue he was simply obsessed with communism to the exclusion of everything else, and still others suggest he had corrupt relationships with organized crime figures. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. The FBI largely ignored the mob's takeover of Las Vegas until it was almost too late to stop it. The man who finally began to change that was Robert F. Kennedy. As chief counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee in the late 1950s, and then as Attorney General under his brother's administration starting in 1961, Kennedy made organized crime a personal crusade. He targeted specific figures, Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, and pushed for legislation that would give federal prosecutors the tools to go after criminal enterprises rather than just individual criminals. The result, years later, would be the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, signed into law in 1970, which would eventually become the most powerful weapon in the government's arsenal against the mob. But in the early 1960s, the mob still had Las Vegas in a chokehold, and the skim was running at full capacity. This is where the story takes a turn that almost no one could have predicted. In November 1966, Howard Hughes, the reclusive industrialist, aviator, and filmmaker, arrived at the Desert Inn in Las Vegas. Hughes was at this point one of the richest men in America, but he was also deeply eccentric, paranoid, and deteriorating both physically and mentally. He had recently sold his stake in Trans World Airlines for over $500 million and needed to invest the cash quickly to avoid an enormous tax liability. He rented the top 2 floors of the Desert Inn and showed no signs of leaving when the casino's management, still connected to Mo Dalitz and the Cleveland Syndicate, asked him to vacate because they needed the rooms for high rollers during New Year's. Hughes responded by buying the entire hotel and casino for $13.2 million. Over the next 2 years, Hughes purchased the Sands, the Castaways, the Frontier, the Silver Slipper, the Landmark, and Harold's Club in Reno. He spent approximately $300 million buying up Las Vegas properties. The effect was seismic. Hughes was not a mobster. He was a legitimate, if eccentric, businessman, and his purchases had the effect of displacing mob ownership from several major casinos. Nevada officials welcomed him eagerly. Hughes provided something the state desperately needed, a veneer of respectability. Here was a famous American industrialist investing hundreds of millions in Las Vegas. How could anyone claim the city was mob-controlled when Howard Hughes was the biggest casino owner on the Strip? But the mob didn't simply disappear. It adapted. While Hughes was buying casinos on the Strip, organized crime networks maintained control over other properties, particularly the Stardust and the Fremont, and continued the skim. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, controlled by allies of the Chicago outfit, continued to provide loans for casino construction and expansion, loans that legitimate banks wouldn't touch. Alan Dorfman, a close associate of Jimmy Hoffa and the fund's key decision-maker, approved hundreds of millions of dollars in loans to Las Vegas casinos throughout the 1960s and 1970s, many of which were effectively kickbacks to organized crime. The pension fund became the mob's bank, and Las Vegas was its primary investment. The full scale of the skim didn't become public until the late 1970s and 1980s, when a series of federal investigations finally cracked the system open. The key case was the Kansas City skim trial, which began in 1985 and involved the skimming operation at the Stardust and the Fremont casinos. The FBI had spent years building the case using wiretaps, informants, and painstaking financial analysis. The recordings were devastating. On one wiretap, Kansas City boss Nick Savella was heard discussing the mechanics of the skim in explicit detail. Another recording captured Chicago outfit figures arguing over their share of the proceeds. The trial resulted in convictions for mob bosses from Kansas City, Chicago, and Milwaukee, and it effectively ended organized crime's direct control over Las Vegas casinos. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal, the man who ran the Stardust's day-to-day casino operations for years and was the basis for Robert De Niro's character in the film Casino, was never convicted but was banned from every casino in Nevada by the Gaming Control Board. His enforcer and protector, Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro, the inspiration for Joe Pesci's character in the same film, was murdered in June 1986, beaten to death, and buried in an Indiana cornfield along with his brother Michael. The murders were ordered by the Chicago outfit, which had concluded that Spilotro had become too violent, too visible, and too much of a liability. His body was found 9 days later. Here's another detail worth pausing on. The total amount skimmed from Las Vegas casinos by organized crime over the decades is, by its nature, impossible to calculate precisely. The FBI and Nevada gaming authorities have offered estimates ranging from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. Some researchers believe the true figure, if you account for the skim across every mob-connected casino from the late 1940s through the mid-1980s, could exceed $1 billion in unadjusted terms. That money funded criminal operations across the country. It paid for political corruption, labor racketeering, narcotics distribution, and the kind of quiet, persistent influence over American institutions that rarely makes headlines but shapes outcomes for decades. The aftermath of the skim trials and the broader federal crackdown on organized crime in the 1980s fundamentally transformed Las Vegas. The mob's exit created a vacuum that was filled by corporate capital. In 1989, Steve Wynn opened the Mirage, a $630 million mega resort financed by junk bonds from Michael Milken's Drexel Burnham Lambert. The Mirage wasn't just a casino, it was a destination with a volcanic fountain, white tigers, and production values that made the old mob-run joints look like roadside motels. Within a few years, the Strip was dominated by publicly traded corporations, MGM, Caesars Entertainment, Las Vegas Sands. The skim was replaced by shareholder returns. The count room was monitored by surveillance systems and audited by independent firms. The Nevada Gaming Control Board, once a sleepy and compliant regulator, developed into one of the most rigorous gaming oversight agencies in the world. But consider the paradox. Every one of those gleaming corporate towers stands on a foundation that was poured by organized crime. The very concept of Las Vegas as a destination resort, the combination of gambling, entertainment, luxury accommodations, and adult indulgence, was invented by men like Siegel, refined by operators like Dalitz and Rosenthal, and financed by networks that included some of the most violent criminals in American history. The infrastructure, the brand, the idea of Las Vegas, none of it would exist without the Mafia. The corporations that now reap billions in annual revenue inherited a business model that was designed in smoke-filled rooms by men who settled disputes with bullets. There is one more thread worth following, because it reveals something about the nature of institutional power that extends far beyond Las Vegas. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, which served as the mob's lending institution for decades, was eventually placed under federal oversight. Alan Dorfman, who had controlled the fund's investments, was shot to death in a hotel parking lot in Chicago in January 1983, just weeks before he was scheduled to be sentenced on federal bribery charges. Investigators believed he was killed to prevent him from cooperating with authorities. The fund's records, once they were finally examined by federal auditors, revealed a pattern of fraudulent loans, kickbacks, and mismanagement that had cost thousands of ordinary Teamsters workers their retirement savings. The men who skimmed the casinos didn't just steal from the house. They stole from truck drivers and warehouse workers who had paid into a pension fund their entire careers, trusting that the money would be there when they retired. In many cases, it wasn't. The story of how the Mafia built Las Vegas is often told as a colorful chapter in American history, a tale of wise guys and showgirls, of rat pack glamour and desert noir, and it is those things. But it is also a story about how power works when oversight fails, when institutions are captured by private interests, and when the line between legitimate business and organized crime becomes so blurred that even the people enforcing the law can't tell the difference. The mob didn't build Las Vegas because they were smarter or tougher than everyone else. They built it because they saw an opportunity that existed in the gap between what was legal and what was monitored, between what the state permitted and what the state was willing to enforce. That gap still exists in industries and cities around the world today. The names have changed, the methods have evolved, and the violence is less visible. But the fundamental dynamic, the exploitation of regulatory weakness by concentrated organized capital with something to hide, remains one of the most persistent patterns in modern economic life. The neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip illuminate a city built on spectacle and risk. What they don't illuminate, what they were never meant to illuminate, is the shadow economy that made it all possible, and the question of whether we've really left that shadow behind or merely learned to look away from it more comfortably.